And I think ultimately a lot of the things that he's grappling with have to do with this question of like, is he allowed his own unique and particular subjectivity? And what is a sort of pure subjectivity? And can a Black artist have their own subjectivity, or is it always this thing that is pressurized and sort of under assault from all corners by the white gaze or by the white imaginary?
Hi, Brandon. How's it going?
Hi, I'm glad to be here. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. You've been living in New York for about 4 years now, and I'm wondering what made you want to take a deep dive specifically into the art scene of New York in this new novel.
Yeah, I mean, well, one of the first things that happened to me on one of my very, very first days in New York is I moved here and I went to like at the opening of the Medici portraits at the Met. And I got a text from a very good friend of mine who's a playwright, and he said, "Hey, what are you doing this evening? Do you want to come to my suite at the Carlisle while I get ready for the Met Gala?" And I was just sitting in the park, like looking at this like catalog book I'd bought. And I was like, yeah, that seems like a plausible thing to do. And on my very first night in New York, I'm sort of out with all of these like famous, beautiful people. And from that moment on, my friend was always sort of dragging me to various play openings or to art openings or to gallery shows and sort of dragging me up and down the glamorous parts of Manhattan. And so I felt like a character in an Oscar Wilde play, actually. And so over the course of those many, many weekends and sometimes weeknights, I just sort of developed this fascination with these people and the way that they sort of talk about art, how it is both like commerce, but also culture, and also like the incredible insidery gossip where they're all gossiping about each other all of the time. And it was just a lot of fun. I don't know, like I think like as a sort of insider outsider of it all, I felt like I had a kind of fly on the wall view of this world.
Yeah, and I mean, you're writing about a contemporary New York in this novel, right? So that reality that you're being confronted with when you open your window is what's in this book. There's so much writing about like the factory scene of the 60s or the downtown art scene. Like I think of the queer artists like Keith Haring, Basquiat. There's a lot of writing about them, but this is talking about like 2022. Why did you want to set this novel so close to the time that you're writing it?
Yeah, I mean, that is the question. I think if I'd had it to do again, I maybe would have set it further in the past. I certainly would, be at less risk of getting into trouble writing about living contemporary great artists. I think at heart I am a contemporary writer. I'm really interested in the contemporary moment. And I think many of the questions that were preoccupying me in the book, felt really, I mean, ultimately they're not contemporary. There's the latest iteration of like ongoing questions of like representation and like whose gaze is the controlling gaze in art? That question goes all the way back to, I mean, maybe even Aristotle. So, they're quite old questions, but I felt like the terms of them and the way that they show up in my own life felt really contemporary, and it felt important to me that it be about now, and that I try to write about how slippery it is to make art right now. There's something incredibly slippery about art at just this moment. And a lot of the issues that I face in my own sort of work and in my own life, as an artist, like trying to transform my own experience, which feels increasingly debased by modernity, like looking at our sort of modern contemporary experience and feeling like there's anything in that worthy of art is incredibly challenging. And I wanted to write about that question, right? And so I don't know, like I found it really interesting and really fascinating, but also really challenging. But yeah, I think if I had it to do again, I would never encourage someone to do what I like. I would never, like, no way, no, it's too hard. Like, set it 15 years in the past, even. Oh, so much easier than to try to write about 2022. That was like, arduous.
It's so funny, like that you've written this novel, and I think written about contemporary life like successfully. But there is something, I guess, people maybe notice more if you get things wrong, whether it's that you have a take on a contemporary artist that's wrong, or people are thinking back to 2022, they maybe have a better memory of what it was like, and they can notice, well, I was in New York, like that's not how it was for me. Like,
Right.
is that part of what was difficult about it for you, or what did you find challenging?
When you're writing about a moment, like you're writing about ultimately like your subjective take on that moment. And I think that sometimes when readers encounter that subjective take, they think that you think you're being objective. And also, there's also the thing that happens where we we like the way that the sort of public imaginary like reconstitutes even the 2010s, right, is so discrete, like so distinctly different from like the facts on the ground in the 2010s. And so there are things that feel like anachronistic or ahistorical in our discourses about the 2010s that if you go back and you look, you're like, no, that really was a thing that we were doing in 2010, right? Like that was like a cell phones were like a thing toward the end there, like that were like taking over the world. So I do think that like sometimes the public imaginary has like certain ahistorical ideas about given periods that they don't realize are ahistorical ideas and that they think are like facts. It's the same way that like in America, at least, what America imagines the 50s to be was invented in the 80s.
Right.
And that
There's
it has
so many films from the 80s that were like weirdly obsessed with the 50s.
right. I mean, in the same way that like so many things in like the 2000s were about the 80s, and like we've kind of like overwritten what was the actual 80s, like with the sort of like post 9/11 like revisionism of the 80s that is like really causing cognitive dissonance for Gen Xers in a like really scary way. And so I don't know, I'm really interested in that, but it does make it then really difficult then because then readers are like, I don't remember it like that, when in fact the thing that they're remembering is like an actually like false memory implanted in their minds by Tumblr or something.
Yeah. Oh, I think my memories of the 2010s are going to be horribly infected by what was on Tumblr in the 2010s. Like horribly so. I want to return to sort of the substance of this novel, Minor Black Figures, starting by talking about your main character, this painter named Wyeth, who I think really is grappling with a lot of these issues that we've been discussing. He's feeling pressure to make art that is responsive to the political moment that he's working in. He also is somebody who's thinking about the art of the past, what gets preserved, what gets misremembered, what gets included in the archive. But he has a lot of conflicting ideas about both of those things. Can you tell me a bit more about Wyeth and what he's grappling with in his work?
Sure. To him, he's doing a kind of genre painting where he's borrowing scenes from what he considers to be sort of canonical or archetypal scenes, and he's just interposing black figures in them. But the way that he's read is that as though he is like commenting on, the sort of underlying canon, meaning like why are there no black people in Cukor? And that's just like a question that would never occur to Wyeth as a painter. And then he paints this set of scenes from Bergman, and then he posts them online during the uprisings of 2020, the George Floyd protests of 2020, and he goes massively viral. And he sells one of the paintings for a pile of money. And part of that experience is that he realizes that the reason that that was possible is because people read some comment into the work that he wasn't intentionally making. And so he is grappling with this question of like, you know, can he as a black painter ever just like paint stuff that he finds interesting? Or is there always some sort of like deeper political read on his work? Is it naive of him to resist this idea? And if it isn't naive, like what is it that's making him resistant to the sort of political reading of his painting? Is there an issue with the audience? Is he painting this stuff because he really wants to paint it or because he's catering to the white gaze or all of this? Is he making paintings for like white people? Is he making paintings for his people? Is there some sort of accepted set of tropes and visual ideas that are acceptable for black art? And if so, is that like a racist assumption, or is that like a racist question to assume that that is a racist assumption, right? He's like doing the sort of Russian dolls of double consciousness. And I think ultimately a lot of the things that he's grappling with have to do with this question of like, is he allowed his own unique and particular subjectivity? And what is a sort of pure subjectivity? And can a black artist have their own subjectivity, or is it always this thing that is pressurized and sort of under assault from all corners by the white gaze or by the white imaginary? And then on the other side of that, he sees these painters that he considers kind of sellouts, but also that their painting is really ugly, and he thinks that they have like an aesthetically dubious project, and yet they're incredibly successful, and he is not. And so then he's like, do I hate their painting because I think it's ugly, or do I hate their painting because I'm jealous, you
Or
know?
like, does he think the paintings are ugly because he's jealous? Like, he needs to
Right.
kind of marry the two ideas together.
Yes, yes, exactly. And like whenever he comes to what feels like a satisfying answer for himself, like something happens to sort of flip it upside down and he's kind of like, or am I just a hater? Am I being Am I like, is this a true aesthetic opinion, or is it motivated by envy or jealousy or my own careerist ambitions? What is at the core of my desire to do the work I want to do? And he's constantly pulling threads and trying to figure it out.
Yeah, I'm curious, like, I guess, how many of these different, as you say, like Russian doll nesting ways of thinking about art, thinking about one's own work, thinking about the work of others, like how much of that comes from how you've negotiated maybe some of these subjects in your own career? Because I see, especially with Wyeth's interest in, say, like, classic European and American Hollywood cinema. Like, you're also somebody who writes a lot about these subjects, like does art criticism in addition to working
Mm.
as a novelist. Like, is this something you've had to confront in your own work at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that every black artist working in a sort of more or less mainstream mode like has to contend with eventually, which is like white eyeballs. I think that's the phrase one of the characters in the book uses. And the question of like how aware of those white eyeballs are you, and are you performing for them, or are you not performing for them in an ostentatious enough manner that proves that you aren't performing for them, but you still kind of are? Um, and I think like in my own life, there was a time when I was like really aware of how I was being read or misread, and I always felt really frustrated about that. And I was trying to sort of like become ever clearer about like the terms of my work so that people would like read me effectively. And then eventually I realized that like in trying to make myself hyper legible, I was in fact betraying so much of my own aesthetic interests because I was like expending all of this energy trying to translate my own considerations and my own themes and my own terms and my own art into like language that was legible to an external gaze. And then I was just like, oh, I can't keep I don't have any energy left to actually do the work I want to do because I'm too busy trying to translate the work into these external terms. And so then I moved away from that and I began to sort of I guess like become interested in that question of outward translation and outward legibility, and like what is it that makes a person want to translate themselves for someone else? What makes a person want to perform for someone else? But then also like I became really interested in the accusation that is made against artists often, which is that they're performing for an external gaze, even when they may not be. And it's like, well, like, why is that the ultimate delegitimizing claim that's laid at the feet of minoritized artists that you're doing this for white people, you're doing this for straight people, you're doing this for men, etc. And I was like, yeah, like why, like what is that accusation about? And is that like a sort of deeply offensive accusation that relies on the same essentialist logic that it's trying to unpack? And so I don't know, like I guess I just became interested in the question of like the essentialist ideas at the bottom of I guess all of this, both the sort of translation of oneself outward, but also the accusation that someone is performing for the sort of overculture. Because I don't know, like it feels impossible to make art if you're constantly worrying about how you're gonna be received.
Wyeth, your main character in this novel, I think he feels this obligation that he has mixed feelings about, but to create art that makes some kind of statement. So not just that he's thinking about the external gaze and who's looking at it, but that there is a specific takeaway that people should get from his art, and that it's almost important that not just the art be read a certain way, but that he be read as someone who has certain political commitments, certain viewpoints, and is like doing something for his people, so to speak. But we see him have conversations with his artist friends where some of them push back pretty aggressively against that idea. And they're like, no, the point of art is not for it to be useful or even to have an impact on people. And the phrase that's used at one point is that that's a death sentence for art. I'm curious, like, I guess, how you feel about that argument, because it sounds like, you have feelings about not wanting to think too much about the gaze, but that strikes me as something different than like not thinking about there being some sort of message in one's art.
Yeah, I mean, I think about this all the time, and it's something that I argue with my friends about all the time. And this tension between what is essentially this tension between like art for art, art for art's sake, or, like should there be like a message, or is there a moral valence to art? Is there a sort of like political valence to art, and all is art political and all of this other stuff? And I think like for me, I began as someone who believed that like art was ultimately about expressing oneself, and it was about expressing agency, and it was just purely a tool for the expression of a single person subjectivity, and that any art that had any kind of that even raised the idea of the possibility of politics was like bad art or propaganda. And then I began to like read all these like left-wing like literary critics plus Northrop Frye, who's like one of my favorite guys. And what I realized is like, oh, actually, like it's much more complex than that. And actually, like all the great novelists that I love and admire were in fact deeply ideologically committed. And in fact, one of the things that makes their work so good is that their work articulates something of the social process. And I think like it made me in my own work want to articulate something of that social process. And so I think in order to demonstrate the social process, what you need is like argument. What you need is like ideological conflict. And so Wyeth is like, I don't know what to do. Should my protest paintings be political? And his friends are like, that's a terrible idea, and I feel like in that conflict, I think in illustrating that conflict, I think ultimately what I hope I achieve is that it sort of captures something real about this moment, which is that there are artists having this argument all the time, like that they are having it all the time, and like the stakes could not feel higher for them. And it's not that I think that there's a right answer to that. I think my right answer about all of this is that what I want to show is the social process, which is to show that these two things are in tension, these two mindsets are in tension, and that artists are grappling with them all the time. And I think the grappling is more important to me than getting a right answer. But I think in showing Wyeth as someone who's like, what is the right answer? I think I'm trying to capture the tension of it.
Yeah, I mean, it tells you something about like who he is as a guy and as an artist, that he seems really committed to the idea that there should be a right answer and should be a correct way of engaging with these things. Yeah, I mean, this novel is so much about Wyeth's relationship with his own art, with the art of others, with different media that he's working in. But Minor Black Figures is also a love story, which is something that I think was kind of unexpected for me upon looking at the title. I was expecting like it entirely to just be like, okay, we're mediating on art. It's New York. It's 2022. I promised the people a hot priest at the beginning of this conversation. So let's talk about the love interest, who's this guy named Keating. He's a Jesuit and he was studying to become a Catholic priest. He was in seminary. But when Wyeth meets him, Keating is questioning that calling and his faith more broadly. Can you tell me a bit about what you wanted to explore with Keating? What's his deal?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I knew basically three things about this book when I started it, that there'd be in New York, that there'd be a painter, that would be like a hot priest. Like those are the three things I wanted to write. I was interested in a book about a crisis of faith. And so there's Wyeth who's having his own crisis of faith. And then I thought, well, the pandemic was also this incredibly like taxing and trying time also for, we think about like the doctors, and we think about the essential workers, right? We think about all of them. But it was also a really taxing time for those people who were spiritually on the front lines. And so I was like, well, if I want to write a priest, like it seems maybe I'll write about a priest who's also kind of grappling with the throes of sort of this spiritual doubt brought on by the pandemic, and maybe that can be a way of exploring like the other side of this question of a calling in an increasingly secularized world, right? What is the fate of the call? Not only in a crisis of faith, but a crisis. Is it possible to have a crisis of faith in an incredibly aridly secularized world where it's all about the IG likes and the hustle culture and all of this other stuff? What does it even look? Is it cringe to have a calling and then to have lost that calling, right? And I think also for many people who are not believers, I mean, I'm an atheist, but I do think that for many people who are not sympathetic to religious belief, that they view a loss of faith as a kind of like wakening into like being rational, and they view it as like probably a net positive. But if you are like a true believer, it's probably a profound change in your life that like what was up is now down, and that there's some material alteration in your very fundamental being. And I don't know, like as an artist, as a novelist, I find that incredibly juicy and very tempting to write about.
How did you as an author get into that kind of mindset of like
Mm.
what it would be like to have this profound spiritual crisis? Like, is that something that you've ever experienced a version of yourself?
For me, I experienced it when I was very, very young. I was raised incredibly religious in a very small Baptist community. And I grew up in a really religious family, like turn out the lights when there's a thunderstorm, like God is working kind of religious family. We weren't fundamentalists, but we were like as close as Black rural Baptists can get to fundamentalism. Like sort of, not, I mean, sort of everyone in my family was a creationist. I'll put it that way. They were all strict creationists. Um, and so I did grow up in that milieu. And then I, around the age of 5 or 6, was like, oh no, this doesn't seem right. Can't square this with the existence of dinosaurs. I'm out. And when I was a teenager, when I told my family I had to break it to them in stages. And so I was like 13, I was like, I'm agnostic. And then that prompted them to lay hands on me and pray over me at a family barbecue because they thought I was
Not at the
going,
barbecue.
yes, family barbecue. And then later I sort of broke it to them that I was an atheist. And so I did, and then I went away to school, science school in the Midwest, where everyone was mostly an atheist except for one or two exceptions. Um, and and so I don't know. I definitely viewed it as like, oh yes, I'm saved from the irrational wilds of intense Baptist thought. But I do think it has like let me be sympathetic to the mindset. Like I understand that for them it is like an entirely coherent worldview and it is like deeply important to them. But I do think a thing happened to me where I was like in these like hyper educated bourgeois circles where I just sort of took for granted that everyone was like an atheist. And I remember talking to a friend who was Catholic and I said, "Oh, do you want to hang out on Sunday?" And he's like, "Oh, I'd love to, like right after I go to church." And I was like, "LOL, right, like you're going to church." And he goes, "No, I go to church every Sunday." And I was like, "But you're not like serious about it." He goes, "No, I'm incredibly serious about it." And I was like, "But we send each other memes. How can you be?" how can, and then I realized that I had sort of made an assumption, right? Like I'd sort of made an assumption. I'd sort of like I had been shocked at how seriously he took his faith, and that like this perfectly modern guy who sends me Garfield memes or like funny tropes was like really serious about God and about Jesus and going to church every Sunday. And I was like, oh, you know what? I have become that. I have become the smug liberal. Like I have become the smug rational liberal who sort of can't fathom that someone would take it seriously. And when I was writing this book, I thought it's okay for Wyeth to be that way, but like the book can't be that way. The book itself has to be all encompassing, and that Keating needs to be, like he's a priest in training, was a priest in training, but he is, he believed deeply enough to dedicate himself to the clergy, right? So, you know, his actions and his thoughts on God are not coming from like a passing fad. It's coming from a place of like deep spiritual belief. And so that was like a thing I had to sort of think through very carefully, that I never wanted to be flippant about God.
Yeah, kind of expanding the lens, I guess, not just talking about minor Black figures, but thinking about all of your work. You've written a lot of characters that have very complicated relationships with parents and especially complicated relationships with mothers. And in Minor Black Figures, the way this manifests with Wyeth's mom is that she started a complete new family in California. She left Virginia. She acts as if Wyeth doesn't exist, doesn't ever acknowledge that she had this other son. What is it about these fraught relationships with mothers and sons that keep you coming back as a writer?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I think I get really frustrated with the way that the sort of like mother-child relationships are depicted in a lot of literature. They're often either like incredibly fraught with like many arguments, or they're like, oh, you took my youth from me, or like, oh, you didn't love me enough, and they just feel very scripted even when they're beautiful and or they're sort of beautiful and warm and affirming. And like I don't know what either of those things are like. Like I don't know what those things are like. And I think when I'm writing, I'm always trying to reflect some of the world as I see it and as I know it to be. And I had a very complicated mother, like an extremely complicated mother, and a very complicated relationship with that mother. And so I think like the mothers in my work and the fathers too, to some extent, like they tend to be, I don't know, like I'm much more interested in the like viewing parents as people who have things that they can't say because of the lives that they've lived, and that they aren't broken by that inability to say it. They just can't say it. And that like it creates all these voids in the relationships with the kids who I'm often writing about. And so I don't know, like, I'm interested in that. I'm interested in the ways that like parents are also people with secrets. Parents are also people who've made complicated decisions. And like there's always a point in your life where you've kind of got to start to view your parents as people who've had lives that you may not have the full context for, and you've got to be able to almost view them as strangers. And like, how would you view this person if they were a stranger who had come into your life later, rather than as the person who didn't hug you enough when you were five? For me, lately, watching my friends become parents and watching my friends like parent their children in these incredibly beautiful, affirming, open ways, in ways that often like directly contradict ways that I was raised, has like really moved me and like really profound ways. Just like watching my parents let their sons play with dolls, for example. Like I was spanked a lot as a child for like playing with my cousin's dolls. And the idea that like kids are just, at least the generation of kids that my friends are raising, like that they're just able to just like play and not worry about anything, whereas I feel like as a child I had a lot of worries. But I also think that like the literature that I was reading up until even like 5 years ago, there was just a kind of what felt phony to me in a lot of the writing about mother-child or parent-child relationships and dynamics. And I think for me, I wanted to write about a Southern family that wasn't big and happy and sprawling and full of raconteurs and like the fun uncle, or like big sprawling black families where people didn't talk a lot, where there was a lot of silence and where it was incredibly hard and really, really difficult. And I think like what I was trying to do is sort of like write a counter tradition to what felt like the prevailing set of narrative tropes around particularly like Southern families, because they're often sunny or like complicated in like a really dark Faulknerian way. And I was like, sometimes it's dark, but also really ordinary. And I found like that's what I was like much more interested in.
I'm wondering because you grew up in an environment that is basically, in my mind, as far as you can get from New York while
Mm.
remaining in the continental United States, and that's rural Alabama. How do the versions of Brandon Taylor that existed back in Alabama and the version that exists now in New York coexist? Do you feel that there's different versions of you, or is there like a cohesion between
Mm.
all of the selves you've been living in different places?
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking about this actually. And yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, like the death warrant for that old self was written the minute I got into university, right? Like the minute I was like going to college was like the end of any possibility I had of like remaining within my community of origin. And some might say that that is the very function of university for like really, harrowing class-based reasons. Um, and so I do think like there's a fair amount of incompatibility, but I also think like I can feel so keenly at times the lessons that I was taught. Like I can feel so keenly like how the fact that I had a sort of black, southern, rural grandmother raised me for the most part, how that shows up in my daily life, like especially when I'm like dealing with people, especially New York. New Yorkers are great, but they do have no manners by southern standards. And so the way that people just like interrupt you they'll be in the middle of talking to someone else and they'll just interrupt or talk over you. And I'm just like, this is beyond. Like this, I feel so aghast. I feel like my Southern grandmother all the time, where I'm just like, oh my God, that's so rude. Like, how could you? And I feel often like quite provincial at times where like things will happen and I'll be like, oh my, I sort of grasp my pearls. And so I think like, you know, I think from the top down, I think like, yeah, I'm like, there's no way I'm like that person. But then I like feel it all the time, the way that like my upbringing shows up in my daily life. And it is like in my manners, it is in my sort of habits, it is in my sort of quality, like the sort of the way that I think, the texture of my thought, and the way that I experience sociality, feel quite inflected through that upbringing. And so, in the same way that I'm not that person, I wouldn't be this person had I not been,
Yeah. Had you
born and
not
raised in
been,
Alabama.
yeah, all of those other selves at all of those other places before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would not feel the tension and irritation I feel when someone interrupts me had I not
Yeah.
had a Southern grandmother.
Brandon, it's been so delightful talking to you today and getting to know you through this novel and this conversation. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It was a thrill.